Chapter 1, in which Mr Finchley retires. It's unlikely that many people noticed Mr Finchley that morning, not because Mr Finchley was the sort of man you wouldn't notice, but because it was that sort of morning, when people's thoughts had little place for other men and women. It was a summer morning, a bright, slightly metallic morning, with the air full of the warmth of dusty gutters and hot roof tiles. It was a pleasant, stirring warmth that invited the mind to thoughts of the country and lazy scenes that lay so close in the summer's future. It was a morning for walking to the tube station or bus point with a stare of mild preoccupation and the beginnings of a self-satisfied smile about the lips. Girl typists and shop assistants thought of hot beaches and coloured bathing costumes, and their nostrils caught the phantom odour of dead seaweed and the alien smell of boarding houses. Young clerks and students twitched their shoulders to the imagined weight of rucksacks and remembered dark little bar parlours in country villages where their long thirsts caused no comment. Family men recalled drowsy days in deck chairs and the squeal of excited children around a stranded starfish. In the stretch of road that is Haverstock Hill, Mr Finchley, had he any reason to concern himself with the thoughts of his fellows that morning, would have been surprised at the exuberance of summer thoughts that the warm morning sun had drawn out. The road was crammed with enough memories of summer and holidays to stock a seaside town and crowd the beaches of Devon to unpleasantness. Mr Finchley was only aware of his fellows as part of the general movement around him. For more years than he liked to recall, he had moved down the hill each morning, surrounded by a city-going crowd. He, like the hundreds about him, was part of the great morning routine. There had been mornings when he'd resented the inflexibility of the economic system which had kept him moving each morning between his home and his office, like a tide pulled and moved about by the moon. And there had been times when he'd longed to face about and walk away from the tube station, right out into the blue of forbidden delights. This morning, things were quite different. For him, this was no ordinary morning. In himself, he showed no signs of the change which was close upon him. He walked soberly along, his umbrella hooked over one arm, his morning paper tucked into place under his shoulder, and his bowler hat pushed back, not enough to disturb his dignity, but just enough to indicate that the morning was better than usual. His black coat, his grey-striped trousers, and his brilliantly polished black shoes were just as they always were, the neat, orderly symbols of his clerkly profession. He walked with the faintly important step of a man who is short and inclined to plumpness, and who has borne nearly 50 years of life without losing much of his optimism or faith in the ultimate decency of everyday people and things. And the face which looked out under the bowler hat reflected much of this philosophy. It was a large, round face, genial, but losing no firmness to mere unconsidered good humour. It was the pleasant, controlled face of a man who knew how to laugh, when to be stern, and how to fly the signals that proclaimed, through the subtle evidence of crease and line, that here was one who had a natural sympathy for his fellows, without inviting exploitation of his good nature. It was this sympathy which was swaying Mr Finchley that morning. It gave him a sense of guilt that he was so close to escaping forever from the habits of a lifetime, from the habits which would still hold firmly the rest of the people around him. He was escaping. This was the last morning he would ever go down to the office. Already some of the last things were done. He had already come out of his house on the corner of Nassington Avenue and walked quietly into Haverstock Hill, dropping into the newsagent's shop for his paper and pipe tobacco. "Morning, Mr Finchley," the tobacconist had called. "Nice morning." He'd handed Mr Finchley his paper and tobacco, and for a moment Mr Finchley had hesitated. He felt he ought to tell the man that this was the last time he would come in of a morning. For years he'd been handing him as usual, and for years he had never strayed beyond the strict conversational limits of nice, cold, or wet morning. He had gone out, telling the man nothing. It would have been wrong to trample down the habit of years by starting a conversation on his last morning.